What if I told you Dracula was real? Not the charming count in a cape, not the pale lover whispering seduction from the shadows. No, the real Dracula was worse, infinitely worse. He was a prince, a warrior, a political genius who didn't need fangs to drain the life out of people. His weapon wasn't bloodlust, it was fear, sharpened into a doctrine of terror that rewrote the rules of power in medieval Europe. His name was Vlad the Impaler of Wallachia, but history remembers him by the name he earned through thousands of corpses, Vlad the Impaler. He didn't just punish his enemies, he turned execution into theater. Impalement wasn't about death, it was about spectacle, about making people watch and remember, and never ever dare rise against him. Some called him a madman, others, a patriot who did what no other ruler dared, stand up to the mighty Ottoman Empire and win, not with armies, but with a reputation so horrific that even hardened generals turned their horses around rather than march into his lands. But here's the twist. This wasn't random cruelty. Vlad wasn't out of control. He was calculating, strategic, and obsessed with order. His horror wasn't a flaw, it was policy. And what he did at one Easter feast, that wasn't legend. That was a message, sent in blood and built on bones. So let me ask you this. If fear gets results, if terror brings peace, is it still evil? Stick with us, because the real Dracula story is more terrifying, more human, and more relevant than any vampire myth. And it all started not with a throne, but with chains. At 13, Vlad Dracula wasn't discovering the world in books or hunting with noblemen in the Carpathians. He was shackled, a hostage, marched deep into the heart of the Ottoman Empire, his wrists raw, his future stolen. The Sultan didn't just take him to ensure his father's obedience. He took him to break him. But Vlad didn't break. He watched. He listened. He remembered. In Edirne, the capital of one of the most ruthless empires in human history, Vlad became a silent witness to power wielded without mercy. He saw how order was maintained not through diplomacy, but through domination. Heads rolled, bodies swung from city gates. Entire villages disappeared overnight. Ottoman justice was not random. It was systemic, swift, public, brutal. It didn't aim to reform. It aimed to erase. In those years of captivity, Vlad was surrounded by cruelty, but he learned to see beyond it. He studied how fear wasn't just a byproduct of violence. It was a tool, a language, a currency more stable than gold, and far more effective than prayer. And he learned something else, that weakness was never forgiven, only punished. Back in Wallachia, his absence became his undoing. His father, Vlad II Dracula, once a proud member of the Order of the Dragon, was betrayed and murdered by the same nobles he had tried to control. Vlad's elder brother, Massacre, didn't fare better. He was captured by rival factions and buried alive, sand packed into his mouth until he suffocated. When word of this reached Vlad inside the Ottoman court, they say he didn't cry, he didn't scream, he simply stopped speaking for days. The silence wasn't grief, it was calculation. Because Vlad had seen how the Ottomans responded to treachery. They didn't mourn betrayal, they crushed it, publicly, permanently. And Vlad, he was taking notes. What happens when a boy raised in chains returns home, not with hope, but with a manual for terror? By the time Vlad was released, he wasn't a prince anymore. He was a weapon, sharpened by humiliation, fueled by revenge, and educated by monsters. And the world he returned to? Wallachia wasn't a kingdom, it was a carcass. The throne was empty, the countryside burned with rebellion, and the nobles who orchestrated his family's murder were richer than ever, playing puppet master to foreign powers, while the common people starved in the ashes of a failed state. But they made one mistake. They thought the boy they betrayed had died in captivity. Instead, he returned, and what came back wasn't just a ruler. It was a storm cloaked in royal blood. In public, Vlad played the role of the prodigal son, bowing to the same noble houses that had buried his brother. He smiled at the men who had gutted his father's legacy, and all the while he waited, because Vlad had no intention of negotiating power. He had learned that fear was faster than politics. He wouldn't beg for loyalty. He'd make disobedience unthinkable. So he began, quietly, one execution here, one traitor arrested there. But beneath the surface, something far larger was brewing, a reckoning. And it would be staged, not in secret, but in the open, with candles, with wine, with music, a feast. And when the doors closed, the old world would burn. But that is a tale soaked in blood and wrapped in velvet, a massacre disguised as celebration. And that story begins at Easter. The year was 1456. The sky above Wallachia was the color of ash, and the ground beneath it soaked with old betrayals. When Vlad Dracula returned to claim his throne, he wasn't met with coronation fanfare or loyal subjects kneeling in reverence. He stepped into a kingdom rotting from the inside, a land cracked by civil war, with foreign armies at its borders and treachery eating away at its core. The seat of power was not a crown, it was a target. His rivals, Hungarian loyalists, Ottoman sympathizers, and corrupt boyars, had turned the principality into a butcher's yard. One faction killed for influence. The next day, another retaliated in kind. No loyalty lasted longer than a bribe. No peace outlived the sunset. And at the center of it all were the boyars, the noble elite ahead. They had killed Vlad's father. They had buried his brother alive. And now they sat smugly in silk robes, assuming that the returning son, once a hostage, now a prince, would play their game. They had no idea. Vlad didn't return to play politics. He returned to erase it. And so began his brutal chess match. Except in Vlad's version, the pawns screamed. He didn't purge his enemies in back alleys or midnight coups. He invited them to court. He smiled, he listened, he asked for advice. Then with surgical precision, he began pulling the strings, cutting some, hanging others, and watching who ran. One noble was arrested for treason, a charge so vague it could apply to anyone. Another was found impaled outside the city walls, publicly, on a dull stake, as a message. But it wasn't enough. Vlad wanted more than control. He wanted to make resistance feel like suicide. What if you knew your enemies wouldn't just die, but die in a way that made their children too terrified to speak your name? That's what Vlad built. Not just a regime, but a climate of dread so suffocating, so omnipresent, it slipped into the bones of the living. He made fear into a constant, like wind or gravity. Something you breathed in. Something that cracked your sleep and hollowed your prayers. It wasn't madness, it was math. Because Vlad understood something the West still struggles to accept. That peace is not the absence of bodily noise, but the memory of it. And so he engineered violence that could not be forgotten. The nobility was the first to fall, but they wouldn't be the last. Foreign envoys began arriving in Wallachia with trembling hands. Traitors passed messages in whispers, terrified of being seen as disrespectful. Diplomats who once scoffed at Vlad's barbarism now refused to remove their swords inside his courtrooms. They knew that in this new Wallachia, one misstep didn't mean exile. It meant a stake. Still, the boyars, the old guard, lingered. Their titles, their estates, their arrogant belief that power was inherited, not enforced. And Vlad had a plan. He would give them a feast, a royal event, a celebration of forgiveness. The invitations went out just before Easter. The nobility dressed in their finest furs and embroidery. They brought their wives, their sons, their daughters. The ballroom was lit with hundreds of candles. Music echoed off stone walls, and the scent of roasted lamb mingled with fresh cut flowers. It was theater, and when the final toast was raised and the great doors shut, so was their fate. But that, my friends, is a tale for another act, because before the feast came the field, a forest, built not of trees but of bodies. It began with silence, a vast, unnatural stillness that stretched across the Wallachian horizon like a warning too loud to scream. Travelers, merchants, scouts, even seasoned Ottoman soldiers recalled approaching villages that looked perfectly normal from a distance. Smoke from chimneys, trees bending in the breeze. But as they drew closer, that illusion peeled away, revealing a sight that would sear itself into European history. It wasn't a forest, it was a massacre, frozen in time. Thousands of wooden stakes, each one crowned by a dying man or woman, their bodies pierced and stretched by gravity. Some had been there for days, others still moaned, their skin drawn tight, their eyes sunken, their screams muted by shock. The stakes weren't sharp. That would have been too quick. Vlad preferred them dull, rounded, so they pushed through flesh slowly, carefully avoiding the vital organs, ensuring victims stayed alive for as long as possible. This was no execution ground. This was a stage. The arrangement wasn't random. The stakes were laid out in perfect geometric patterns, circles, spirals, long rows like military formations. It was architecture, designed to be seen from miles away. Vlad didn't want to hide his violence. He wanted it burned into the eyes of every passerby. The message was simple. Here, resistance ends in agony. And no one was safe. Peasants who stole, boyars who schemed, Ottoman soldiers who trespassed, all found themselves elevated above the fields, suspended between life and death, turned into warnings made of flesh and fear. One German merchant wrote of the smell, horses refused to ride forward. His party wrapped their faces in cloths soaked with wine and vinegar. Another diplomat described how birds refused to perch near the impaled, as if nature itself recoiled. The most chilling account came from Sultan Mehmed II himself, the man who had conquered Constantinople. As his army pushed into Wallachia in 1462, they reached a valley now known as Tepesh's Grove. There, in one horrifying glance, they saw the work of a single man. 20,000 Ottoman corpses impaled in rows as far as the eye could see. Uniforms still intact, eyes wide open. A ghost army held mid-death. The Sultan, one of the most ruthless military minds in history, turned back, not because of defeat, but because of fear. He saw in Vlad something most conquerors never encountered, someone who didn't just fight back, someone who changed the terms of the fight entirely. Vlad didn't care for victories measured in territory or trophies. He measured success by silence, by the stillness of enemy advances, by the gap between a warning and a war. And for a time, it worked. Foreign dignitaries began to document what they called the Dracula method. Not a military strategy, but a psychological one. Diplomats noted how Vlad wouldn't just kill, he'd curate death, boiling, skinning, crushing. He used execution like an artist uses paint, each technique chosen for effect, each audience considered. Fear became his foreign policy. Domestically, the people were paralyzed. Whispers about Vlad's justice filled marketplaces and churches. Rumors said he had eyes everywhere, that birds sang differently when he was near, that even the devil stayed clear of Wallachia at night. And Vlad, he fed the myth. He dined among the dying. He spoke to the impaled like old friends. He once offered a guest a higher stake to avoid the bad smell from those decaying below. Was it madness or theater? Either way, the effect was total. The roads became safe, not from justice, but from dread. Trade increased, crime plummeted. No one dared steal a loaf of bread if the price was to become fertilizer in Vlad's forest of flesh. But every kingdom built on fear is also built on rot. The world watched, and the world waited. Because the next move, it wouldn't come from the Ottomans, it would come from within. Spring 1459, Easter in Wallachia bloomed with expectation. Across the countryside, the nobility of old bloodline, boyars draped in furs and arrogance, prepared for a royal summons unlike any they'd received since Vlad's return to power. The young prince, now firmly enthroned, had extended invitations to every powerful house in the realm. A grand banquet at his court in Targovishte, an olive branch, a rebirth of trust. The boyars, ever eager to maintain influence, convinced themselves that it was. The son of Dracula must finally be ready to forgive. After all, politics was a dance, and in their minds, Vlad was still just a child playing king. But Vlad wasn't dancing, he was designing a stage. They arrived in procession, lords, ladies, their children, dressed in silken pride. Courtiers filled the candlelit hall with forced laughter, the clink of goblets, the rustle of court gossip. The feast was lavish, spit-roasted meats, towers of pastries, wine from Moldavian cellars. The air shimmered with music, and servants moved like shadows between long tables. And then, Vlad rose. He didn't speak immediately. He let silence settle first, like dust. Then he offered a toast to peace, to unity, to the future of Wallachia. The nobles clapped, smiled, drank. That's when the doors slammed shut. Iron bars fell into place. Soldiers stepped forward, swords drawn, faces unreadable. The feast had ended. The reckoning had begun. What followed was not chaos, it was choreography. What if you toasted to peace with the same mouth that would scream in agony minutes later? The older boyars, the ones who had voted to betray Vlad's father, the ones who had stood by as his brother was buried alive, were seized immediately, dragged outside to prepared stakes, impaled in their feast clothes, their silk tunics soaking with blood, their jewels catching the sunlight as they convulsed. Vlad did not leave, he dined among them. Witnesses recorded how he sat calmly, finishing his meal as the stakes rose around him. He commented on their expressions, their cries. He mocked their titles. "My lords," he said, "I offer you the height you've always craved." Then came the younger nobles. They weren't impaled, no. Vlad had other plans. He stripped them of their titles, their lands, their families, right there in the banquet hall. Then, still in their ornate Easter garb, he marched them under armed guard across the mountains to the site of Panari Castle. There, Vlad's fortress would rise, not with stone alone, but with human labor. Velvet shoes shredded on rocky paths, silk robes turned to rags. Former aristocrats hauled stones by hand, digging foundations beneath the whipping cold. They were denied shelter, denied rest, beaten, starved. They collapsed. They died. And the ones who survived, he didn't set them free. He buried them in the walls, literally. Bodies became bricks, blood became mortar. The stronghold was raised on their suffering, sealed with their bones. Castle Poenari wasn't just a symbol of Vlad's rule. It was a tomb, an eternal monument to the death of the old world. What made this event more than revenge was its surgical precision. Vlad hadn't just eliminated his enemies. He destroyed the system that gave them power. He erased an entire generation of aristocracy, removing the bloodline threat that had haunted his rule since childhood. And he did it in a single night. Foreign powers heard of it within weeks. The story spread to Hungary, Poland, even to the Ottoman court. Ambassadors whispered of a ruler who served execution as ceremony, who could orchestrate a massacre with the elegance of a mass. And they understood. This was no longer a prince seeking approval. This was a sovereign making a statement. Wallachia would no longer bend, not to noble families, not to foreign crowns, not to time. And Vlad's enemies? They now feared more than his armies. They feared his imagination. Because to oppose him was not to die, it was to be remembered forever, in agony, in spectacle, in legacy. By the time Vlad the Impaler was captured in 1462, his legend had already outgrown the man. The forest of stakes, the banquet of blood, the nailed turbans, they weren't just stories. They were symbols, warnings etched into the psyche of a continent. But here's the paradox. His terror worked. Wallachia stayed independent longer than anyone thought possible. Crime vanished. Enemies hesitated. Even the Ottomans, Europe's unstoppable force, flinched. And yet, Vlad died as he lived, violently, alone, surrounded by betrayal. So was he a monster, or was he the only ruler willing to do what his broken world demanded? Was his cruelty madness, or clarity? History paints him with blood. Pop culture turned him into a vampire. But maybe the truth is more terrifying. That Vlad wasn't inhuman. He was human, at his most ruthless. Now the question is yours. Was he a savage tyrant? Or a visionary who understood that fear, when wielded like a sword, could carve out peace? Let us know what you believe in the comments. And if you're still haunted by Vlad, you're not alone. Because what he left behind wasn't just a legacy, it was a question. One we're still too afraid to answer. So, who should we dissect next? Which legend? Which villain? Which icon? Subscribe to the channel, drop your theories. Share this with someone who still thinks Dracula wore a cape. History is darker than fiction, and we're just getting started.